Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Global Hydrogen Full Court Press interview series. We're really taking a deeper dive into the space and tracking this massive push forward into this hydrogen opportunity across multiple industries, governments, and stakeholders. And we're joined here today with our special guest, 𝗛𝗆𝗶𝗶𝗴, Chief Executive and Co-founder of 𝗥𝗲𝗹𝗶𝗁, very much an expert in this space and driving this opportunity forward. Currently joining us from New Zealand. Thanks for joining the show, Andrew.
Hey, great to have. Thanks for having me.
So just to kick off, more of a global type of perspective, we're seeing these headlines on hydrogen come out everywhere. There's, visions being put forward, initiatives. But is this really just kind of more of that PR sense, or are you actually seeing amongst industry, amongst stakeholders, real tangible initiatives being taken forward to implement them and move things forward in the future?
Yes, look, I think really we kind of need all these things to happen. So if you think about, your why and your what and your how of hydrogen, that messaging and understanding the role it can play, why it has a role to play, what it can apply to, how we can get it there. They're really important conversations to have, because that sets policy thinking, it sets business thinking, it gives some confidence to and steer to the technology developers and the business models that might emerge. So I think that framework and the strategic work that's been done globally is absolutely necessary. And I think the world has really moved beyond the why, for example. I think you'll still get pockets of detractors and cynicism about this on occasion, and I think it is important to message that the green, the blue, all these sort of conversations to be had. But the most important thing is, okay, so given that framework, how can we actually get these things going? What are the models that can work now, and how can we get that getting some traction? So look, I think it's very important to still have that broader sense, but now it's the so what. Let's go do, and what do we need to have in place to actually execute?
And now in that what aspect is, as we speak to our energy stakeholders here, for example, in the Middle East, it still feels very much in that ABCs phase. It reminds me of, a few years ago when the whole fourth industrial revolution initiative came out. People were talking about blockchain and implementing digital strategies and so forth. But a handful of years on, we're still at the starting stage for companies of developing their strategy and vision and so forth. Are you seeing that as well in terms of stakeholders, where there's still that first step that really needs to be taken in? What's our strategy? Where do we want to go? What's our roadmap?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of that happens both in businesses, it happens in regions and in countries, and what's their role going to be, what steps can they take. The challenge is to not get analysis paralysis. Is at the end of the day, we can write lots of reports, but we do need to go do, and it's finding the applications that can work early. So the applications that don't need as many stars to align. Don't get me wrong, anything to do with hydrogen needs a number of stars to align, and that's the challenge. That's the role for companies like 𝗥𝗲𝗹𝗶𝗴, what we do, which is to help align those stars through the value chain and get the partners to connect and actually create that commercial pathway. But we are seeing that there are sectors that this can start to work now, and we actually, to be honest, we kind of need to get it to work now. We focus heavily on really three main areas for three different reasons. So the first area is absolutely heavy transport, and the heavy transport it has two things. The emission reduction impact heavy transport can have is very high. The volumes that you can create with a small number of vehicles is also high. What hydrogen needs is scale, and it needs to come off the page, it needs to come off the presentation, it needs to turn into some fairly substantial equipment and commitments and spend. It needs that scale, and you can create that scale if you're dealing with big things. 10 trucks is the equivalent to 1,500 cars. So so if we can create those sort of scale scenarios, we can quite quickly start to create the commercial models. So that's where we focus. So classic one is you take what heavy transport is, you're displacing diesel. Diesel is a high value energy commodity, right? It has a high value use, and hydrogen can go into that space, an electrochemical reaction, and displace that area, and it can displace it on scale. It doesn't take many trucks. So suddenly I'm in a pretty good price support, and also I can easily build some volume and scale. So that's a good place to go. Other areas that might be slightly less price support but have got scale are things like industrial chemicals, because there's still a chemical reaction going on. It's a little bit better than just burning the molecule. So I can create some reasonable price support and scale. So it's looking for those opportunities and the companies that are into that. And to be honest, a lot of companies are in New Zealand, in Australia, and I know across the world, more and more companies are starting to commit fairly aggressive targets coming off their contribution to the climate change commitments and their countries' commitments. A lot of companies we work with, industrials, have got 50% emission reduction by 2030 on their company statements. It's part of their strategy, and if they're going to achieve that, there's only so many places they can go. So,
they're on track to achieve that at the moment.
Well, the challenge is if you don't accelerate the areas that are the lower hanging fruit, it's going to be very, very hard. When a company looks at that whole value chain and where their emissions come from, there'll be some that are really, really hard. You take concrete, so if concrete is part of your mix, pardon the pun, you've got a big emissions problem associated. So maybe you do need to focus on the trucks that deliver the concrete, because I've got a solution there, but I may not be able to address this core product. So a lot of that is starting to be looked at more and more in the boardrooms, certainly in this part of the world. And that's providing some very tangible activities they can do. So we're seeing that reflected in the commitments with the first 20 trucks, for example, that we're putting onto the road here next year, that there's a huge oversubscription of those 20 trucks. So there's far more companies, there's more than 20 companies that want to put zero emission trucks on the road. It's just at the moment, it's at 20, then it's going to be 50, then it's going to be 80, right? But those first 20 trucks, there's a very strong interest right through industry to say, hey, I want one of those trucks and let's get going. And then in the industrials, a very good example is our joint venture partnership with 𝗵𝗨ance Agri-Nutrients. So we're doing a wind to hydrogen and ammonia project, and it's a 50-50 JV with an industrial. So they are investing real money and have been investing real money. We're just about to hit financial close on that project and go build it together. And that's real money coming from a conventional industrial investing in this space actively.
So those are all active and positive signals. And looking at I would say, momentum in New Zealand, where do you think international partnerships might play into this growth opportunity? New Zealand seems like it's setting a standard for, especially with organizations like yours and of course who you're collaborating with, of how the model might be looking in terms of success in the future. Do you see that international partnerships are going to play a massive role in this hydrogen economy?
Oh, for sure. So the first thing is, come on down. This is a test bed, right? So New Zealand is this wonderful OECD country that's kind of got all the ingredients, but realizes, so our role can be, we can bring together the ecosystems and get them working at a national level. But by all means, these are things we need to repeat. So how can we use the ecosystem here to accelerate and understand these business models, get the technology working in the right mode, get the partnerships right, so that we can then repeat and help decarbonize the rest of the world, or be part of helping decarbonize the rest of the world. So that's a very important concept. It's interesting that you don't need to go to the really big markets. In fact, it's sometimes harder in the big markets to get some of these things going because it's somewhat more chaotic. I think a really good example is the challenge of building a refueling network in the middle of Europe, because there's so many ways to get from A to B. And so where do you put your stations?
It's complicated.
So there's these little steps that we can start to achieve here, we leverage the fact we've got a well-sized economy, but big enough to do it right and small enough to do it right. So that's a real interesting role. And the role then for international players is to come and help and be part of it. You know, the capital required in any country is going to be substantial. So we've got investor partners, we've got strategic partners coming in that are international, mixed with a blend of good local capital, because this is also, you know, this is a lot of this activity is building infrastructure for the country. So you definitely want to have some good domestic investment in it. But that mix is the healthy one, because we can refine and we can accelerate both taking some of those models external, but also some of those international partners can help bring some fresh ideas and thinking and access to maybe technologies we wouldn't have access, even if it's about just the scaling that we can do to attract that technology.
Just touching on the financing aspect real fast, what are the challenges that you're seeing in terms of financing hydrogen at the moment?
So we at the moment I'd characterize our projects. We've got two main projects at the moment. They're just hitting financial close. So one's the refueling network for trucks, and the other is that wind to hydrogen project I talked about. And they both obviously very much connect, but they are treated as two separate projects. And when you look at that, we have a mix of there's really three elements. There's equity investment from ourselves and our equity partners. There is a government component in both of them, but it's generally more of a debt type instrument. So it's maybe a government component that is stepping in the space of where more banks might come or more finance might come. And then there is a debt part as well in certainly one of the projects, for example. So we've got to the point where we want to create commercial models, investable models. The government's role in this case is less about a full grant handout. It's more about coming in and stepping in and propping up some of the funding models early, but then down the track, it will be an ongoing mix of debt and equity for these sort of projects. What we're seeing is very, very strong interest from the banks to get involved both in we've got project finance to do here, building, you know, in industrial sort of upstream type projects. And then we've got vehicles and infrastructure to match the vehicles. So clearly on the vehicle side, it's already commonly a debt lease based model that happens with vehicles already in the diesel world, in the battery electric space. So there's that component going on, and then there's also in the project finance really strong interest. So we're seeing, you know, with the offtakes that we've achieved, because we do have offtakes for our molecules and for our electrons, or at least a proportion of the molecules and a proportion of the electrons, that's enabling us to get even non-recourse finance. So there's a strong interest from the banks. They are looking for these sort of green investments. They're looking at where the models can stack up. They can see line of sight to income. And look, at the end of the day, it's down to good project economics 101.
Yeah, I think that's all positive. And we're seeing that, I think, globally as well, coming from banks with that incentive and, of course, I would say drive for that financing space.
I would say there's a huge role, and it's already starting, the huge role that banks have. I mean, we are definitely getting a lot more interest than the conventional sector might get into finance at the moment, but we're also seeing a real upskilling coming through from the finance sector. So they are learning this, and they're learning rapidly. And what are the components that are going to unlock and enable these technologies? So that's pretty exciting. They're fast to learn.
I think you just touched on, upskilling in that industry in terms of learning, but in terms of upskilling and drawing talent into this space, what are your thoughts on that in terms of the industry itself being able to draw on the skill sets that are needed? I'm thinking here as well in the Middle East with these visions and initiatives. Whether or not that talent is there that can drive this opportunity for it.
Look, I think this is a very interesting question, because I've come from the oil and gas myself, and from the oil and gas industry myself. Traditionally, it's an exciting industry, really well paid. People travel the world, have amazing global careers in it. we can offer an exciting industry. We can't offer yet, can't offer the pay that oil and gas has got, you know.
But you can argue that younger talent, you know, in terms of purpose, sustainability is a big part of that and what they want to do.
Exactly. And so what we are absolutely seeing is that paycheck is not as important as the life paycheck they're getting, right? So we've got an incredible team, and it's really the grey hairs within our organisation are just helping conduct the orchestra, and we've got the leads and the cellists and so on. They're out there, incredibly creative people, incredibly driven. And what we really, our role is to bring the skills, certainly myself and Kathy, one of our other founders, we've come, you know, we're classic Gen Xers. We've seen the old world, we've seen the new world, we've got the scars, the battle scars, and we can bring that. But the fresh ideas of how and the smarts is coming through. And that, when people really get to, when the world's a oyster in terms of these opportunities, and when that fulfillment coming from executing real projects, making new things happen, the money will come. Yeah, it may not be as much as someone gets at a rotation job in oil and gas sector, going to a remote area.
Yeah.
But the other elements of life, and that will ultimately be good incomes for people. But there's an incredible breadth of what people are looking for, and we have no shortage of talent interested in coming and working with us, and we see that with other colleagues and other businesses that are doing similar things.
Just moving back to more of I would say a wider perception is, again, the conversations around establishing hydrogen hubs, and the idea of, do you establish the hub with your manufacturing base there, for example, or production base there, and export hydrogen through sustainable, I would say, you know, steel, for example, or do you just try to export hydrogen itself, which might be a more expensive process? What do you think is the model that you're seeing that might be the best path forward, and really kind of the first steps that might have to be done in order to achieve that? Again, here in the GCC, you have visions that are being put out, and then that initial phase of seeing what puzzle pieces look like.
Yeah, so look, I think what we've seen is, it goes back to the point where the models that can actually start to stack up now, or I can see a pathway to get that commercial. So if I've got offtakes, that means I can introduce debt. You know, if I've got an offtake for, one of the interesting things between hydrogen is both electrons and hydrogen and the interplay between the two. That creates a better model, more investable model. Now, don't get me wrong, those offtakes can come with an export offtake, but I think the challenge is that they're much longer timeframes. There's time to be had before those will really materially emerge in any great quantity. But that's definitely where it's headed. But in the meantime, if you can find sites or locations or businesses or partnerships that have got a potential need for hydrogen, be it into their transport fleets, be it into an industrial, like you're saying, steel or a petrochemical of some form. If you can find that and you can couple that with a renewable, that is a very good place to start, because you've cut down so many of the other costs, like you're saying, the cost of the value chains. Look, shipping of hydrogen, for example, or other derivatives will absolutely be commercially viable. That I think is clear. In other words, as a proportion of the total cost of the value chain, the shipping is not going to be prohibitive. But it needs a lot of scale, you know, and the technologies that are going to unlock that, certainly on the really big scale of, say, large-scale liquid hydrogen, there's work to be done, you know, and so it's not going to turn up now. So it's a much longer play.
If you're looking path of more resistance and friction than the alternate.
Yeah, and look, to be honest, I think another piece of advice I would put out there to folks contemplating, if you can identify a project that's tangible, quantifiable, and have less factors. It's all about risk management and what externalities are exposed to versus things that I can control. And if you can get a good partnership going that's got those ingredients, like I said, say a heavy industrial, a good healthy fleet, a partnership that you can form that kind of in a way you can control your own destiny together with your partners, that's just going to be easy business. It's going to be more fundable, more financeable, and both from the equity side and the debt side. I think then the other thing that those sort of projects can do is maybe attract some of the, they should still be able to attract some, where if need be, government assistance in some form, whether it be early forms of debt, this sort of thing. So if you're creating that industry, creating that ecosystem in country, which is jobs, right? Countries like jobs and they like export dollars, and if you can get the two to align, great. But sometimes it's often one or the other, and so I think those early ones can attract the jobs, build enough scale, and that all sets the time frame to ultimately be export. There's nothing stopping that steel mill from having the land next door, if it's got a good renewable resource, for example, to then scale up and export. That would be my advice to those things. That I think is kind of the general gist of how we're looking at it here. There are definitely straight to export projects being discussed, but it doesn't take long for most of those projects to realise that they do need to look for some pretty hefty domestic, and find some of those early domestic offtakes and opportunities.
I just wanted to shift to more specifically, we touched on it briefly with vehicles earlier, but really, when we talk about hydrogen fuel cell technology, for example, the adoption of these vehicles, it's about, let's say, driving down costs while enhancing performance, to really get greener vehicles onto the road. What do you think needs to be done in the short term, right now, in order to help expedite the hydrogen fuel cell technology and hydrogen vehicles and the adoption of it?
Yeah, I think that it's your classic technology cost curve, right? There's no two ways about it, and so the first thing that anyone analysing this, you need to count on that cost curve, and you need to help drive that cost curve, because it would be stupid retrospectively looking back going, gee, I'm surprised that those costs came down. So you need to anticipate it, and the first thing is understand it. What's going to drive those cost curves down? So in the manufacturing, it is absolutely, I build 1, I build 10, I build 100, I build 1,000. Interestingly, by the time you're at 1,000 units, you actually, in a lot of these things, you've achieved huge cost downs. So you might have achieved 80% of what you're going to gain in the first 1,000 vehicles. If I'm talking heavy transport, for example. So understanding what cost impact is of volumes and actually starting to trace, so I need to sell or buy 200 trucks or 300 trucks, and therefore my price comes to that. So to me, that's where really good relationships and open book relationships between the OEMs and the users and companies like ourselves facilitating that integration. So that's the first thing. What's it going to take for the cost down to happen, and design that into your strategy. So that's the first thing. So that's that very open book value chain understanding of costs. Secondly, there still will be a gap because of that, right? Because at the end of the day, 10 is going to be more expensive than 100 is going to be more expensive than 1,000. Right. So how do you bridge that difference and get the end users able to afford an increased cost? But we can't expect that an end user who's in a competitive market can suddenly afford to pay 2 to 3 times the cost for a vehicle.
Yeah.
So then it comes down to what mechanisms can you do, and we've got to recognise these cost downs that we're talking short time frames. We're only talking, if you take a fleet of, say, if someone's got a fleet of 100 vehicles, by the time they get halfway through transitioning their vehicles, they could be on parity with diesel. It's not needing that much, but there is going to need to be some help. So a push in the very near term to help on the cost of the vehicles, I think, is is important, and different ways to do that, whether it's cross funding, you know, so recognizing that the diesel trucks of the road might be able to cross levy costs on a few small vehicles, sorry, a small number of vehicles. That is something that we do need to seriously consider globally, because, and you'll always get an argument against it, but actually if we need to change, we do need to address this gap, because at the moment the oil and gas sector and be it on the vehicle side or be it on the production side, yeah, they have had 150 years of economy of scale and haven't paid their back taxes, right? When it comes to carbon. So we've got to realize there does need to be a little bit of leveling of the game. And so there's a role for government in that, whether it be direct or whether it be through legislation. There's the role, I do think this is an interesting part for banks, to work out how can they maybe help provide some sort of mezzanine mechanisms to help that sort of journey. So I think there is an interesting role for finance coming into that. And it's all about driving the cost, because the vehicle count up to get the cost down. So by the time you're at, say, 100 vehicles or 1,000 vehicles, you've now closed the gap. You're not having there's no cross subsidy needed on those vehicles. They're going to be able to find their own path. And then things like carbon tax will be more relevant. So now you've actually, only then have you created a true even playing field, right? Because it's all very well to look at carbon tax going forward, but there's a back tax problem that's enabled that competitive economy scale of the incumbent. So to just look forward and say carbon tax is the tool that you're going to use to do that difference, it's too blunt a stick. It's not going to be effective. But once you've created a closer playing field, a more even playing field, absolutely, your tools like carbon tax or ETS and these sort of things and carbon credits will come into play more.
I think 25 minutes have gone by pretty fast. We're just about to wrap up. I'm sure we could keep talking for quite a while. But as tradition, we usually ask what your over the horizon views are for this space. But I'd like to really focus instead on what signals are you looking for, over the next year that will really give you indications that the dial has been turned in the right direction. We have COP26 coming out. Again, we're kind of hopefully recovering into a post-pandemic green era. What are you really monitoring to see that progress is at least pushing forward in 2021, 2022?
Yeah, good question. So I think we saw a huge shift with COP21 and through the last decade, and the move where things like hydrogen and other things really came to the fore, and the conversation shifted. It shifted in the governmental space, and it shifted with some of the industrial players. I think what we're really going to see, and it goes back to my point about setting targets in the boardrooms, we need to see that the shifts in the boardroom are real. We need to see that it's not greenwash, and we need to see the money being spent. So part of that, and we're starting to see the visions of that, sort of the indications of that in the partners that we've got, but it's going to be where it becomes the majority, where it becomes the standard way of doing it, not just waiting on the outliers to do this step. So I think the momentum, and there'll be some measures that will be around, some obvious measures will be the proportion of debt going into renewable projects and things like green hydrogen projects as opposed to oil and gas and coal. It'll be some of those stats coming through. It will be the evidenced changes that are happening in the big mega companies that are talking about a big pivot. More of that I'd expect to happen. I think that we'll start to see. And what we've seen is in New Zealand, we have done, there's a lot of work that's been done about how can New Zealand meet its climate change ambitions and commitments. And it's starting to narrow down into the eyes being on the businesses. And so they are going to get policy and legislation coming through. That's definitely going to start to really impact. We got a lot of phone calls now from companies that are front-footing that, but there are companies that we're going to get a lot more phone calls because there are companies that are not going to be able to escape it anymore. So that shift in policy on the back of COP26, I think, is going to be quite massive, or certainly be a strong indicator that we hit the government policies changing and the big boardroom decisions shifting.
Well, thanks, Andrew, for all of your insights as we wrap up. Appreciate your time. For those who are watching this interview, feel free to follow Andrew on social media, as well as this organization, and of course, our handle, Gulf Intelligence, where we will be posting this interview as well as our essentially weekly series. But thanks again, Andrew, for your time, and we look forward to hopefully being able to meet again or meet in the future in person.
Great. Thanks so much, Brian. And thanks everyone for listening.